शन्नो मित्रः शं वरुणः शन्नो भवत्वर्यमा शन्न इन्द्रो बृहस्पतिः शन्नो विष्णुरुक्रमः नमो ब्रह्मणे नमस्ते वायो त्वमेव प्रत्यक्षं ब्रह्मासि त्वामेव प्रत्यक्षं ब्रह्म वदिष्यामि ऋतं वदिष्यामि सत्यं वदिष्यामि तन्मामवतु तद्वक्तारमवतु अवतु मामवतु वक्तारम् ॐ शान्तिः 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 ॐ सहनाववतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै ॐ शान्तिः 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 ॐ यश्छन्दसां वृषभो विश्वरूपः छन्दोभ्योऽध्यमृतात् सम्बभूव समेन्द्रो मेधया स्पृणोतु अमृतस्य देवधारणो भूयासम् शरीरं मे विचर्षणं जिह्वा मे मधुमत्तमा कर्णाभ्यां भूरिविश्रुवं ब्रह्मणः कोशोऽसि मेधया पिहितः श्रुतं मे गोपाय ॐ शान्तिः 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 ॐ अहं वृक्षस्य रेरिव कीर्तिः पृष्ठं गिरेरिव ऊर्ध्वपवित्रो वाजिनीव स्वमृतमस्मि द्रविणं सवर्चसं सुमेधा अमृतोक्षितः इति त्रिशङ्कोर्वेदानुवचनम् ॐ शान्तिः 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 So this fourth Shanti Mantra, Mantra of Peace, which we have been discussing over the past classes, for the sake of explanation and for the sake of a better understanding, I had presented this mantra as being divided into 7 steps. By steps, I understand progressive stages which follow naturally each other. somehow one needs to be within the previous one to achieve the subsequent one, the following one. The Sanskrit word for, because I had been using the word steps, stages, progressive stages, I think but a very literal translation of the Sanskrit word which comes to my mind and which is frequently used in this sense by Sage Patanjali. In fact, by Patanjali, which means by yogic masters, as well as the Mahayana Buddhist masters who deal in the field of yoga, the Yogacara tradition specifically, not all Buddhist masters, but the ones that have written on yoga. They divide the journey of yoga into various, you can call them grounds. The Sanskrit word bhumika. Bhumi means earth. Bhumi is the word for earth. And bhumika are levels, grounds, progressive grounds, grounds which one achieves with understanding, with practice, with realization. They are called bhumika. And for Patanjali, practice means first to achieve a ground and then to be firmly seated in it before progressing into the next one. That is his very definition of practice. When he defines practice in the first chapter, first of all, one needs to practice to achieve a certain level, and then one needs to practice to remain in it. Both are required, and for that he says dirghakala, which means one needs to practice for a very long period of time, uninterruptedly, without any interruption, and with complete dedication. That is what Patanjali says. Generally, the yogic masters, they speak of 7 progressive stages, or it depends which part of the Yoga Sutras. The last 2 chapters speak of 4 progressive stages. The second chapter, before he starts speaking about Ashtanga Yoga, he speaks about 7 progressive grounds. And the Buddhist masters, they speak of such as Acharya Asanga, one of the great Mahayana Buddhist masters. He has composed a complete text known as, the very title means the grounds of the practice of yoga. And he speaks of no less than 17 grounds, 17 steps. So, in the same way, there it is meant that the previous one leads to the subsequent one. And the same thing one sees, the way that when one tries to understand these mantras specifically in the light of several ancient commentaries, the most ancient one of which is Shankaracharya's commentary composed, written in the 7th century, 8th century approximately, 1200 years ago. So one can see that each ground progresses and is a subtler state of the previous one. We see that also in the 8-limbed path of yoga. Asana is a preparation for pranayama. Pranayama naturally then leads into pratyahara. A deepened pratyahara leads into dharana. Dharana, when practiced well, leads into dhyana. And dhyana eventually, when it is deeply rooted, it naturally becomes samadhi. And that's why they can be looked upon as bhumikas. The 8-limbed path of yoga can be looked upon as the 8 bhumikas, as the 8 steps, or the 8 grounds. And in the same way, here also, first of all, because the first step was breaking identification with the physical body as well as the subtle body, which means not identifying with it, that this is what I am, but I, as the conscious essence, as consciousness, I am not this unconscious body, but I am the prime mover. I am the one that moves, that inspires this tree by which was meant the physical body. So this was as a first level of realization, which then on a more subtle level one understands that one breaks identification with the accumulated labels, which was what he describes in the second stage, my true fame is higher than the peak of the mountain. So he completely breaks, the way I explained it, the way when we were going through this, we saw that this realization can only occur when he breaks away from the accumulated identifications. And then, that then leads him to this realization that deep within myself, at the very source, I am not only pure, but I am that essence which purifies everything, which is the very source of purity. So from that, I understood, I took out the idea of, first of all, forgiveness, because by forgiveness I understand freeing oneself from the guilt of the past deeds which were committed by him specifically. We have a very clear example, Triśaṅku, who had committed past mistakes in his life, and the guilt of not having done what should have been done. These are the two types of guilts. So that is what I understood, raising beyond this guilt. Because guilt is useful as long as it stops us from committing the mistake again. But once we have raised beyond, then to carry that guilt is of no use. It is detrimental. And that is what I had explained as, first of all, forgiveness to oneself. And then, at the same time, because the realization that I am pure at the very source, similarly everybody else at the very source is pure. And therefore then this idea of forgiveness to all. Understanding that whatever they are committing is out of ignorance, because due to ignorance, due to the darkness of ignorance, that pure souls has been overshadowed, and that's why they are committing. So with this understanding, this doesn't mean that we have to accept their atrocities, but we can at least, within our heart, forgive them for what they have done. So that then becomes the third step, and the fourth step, which then leads into higher progressive stages. The fourth one, Vajini Vaswamrtamasmi, I am the immortal essence which is the same as in the sun. So his identification with the greater truth, with the universal truth, no more identifying with the limited. Now he has broken his identification with his limited identity, and he is ready to take upon a greater, a universal identity. This is what we see happening in the fourth step when he declares Vajini Vaswamrtamasmi, I am the immortal essence which is the same as the one within the sun, in the source of life and light. Then the next one, this realization then leads him into becoming a visionary master, where he is no more relying on the Vedic teachings, but the Vedic teachings start arising within him. He has become a rishi which means a Vedic seer, someone who sees mantras, who sees those greater truths and has the capacity to express them. And that is when he declares that the radiant wealth is within me. I have found that radiant wealth within me. That radiant wealth refers to the Vedic teachings. That is the radiant wealth. So he finds that within himself. That will be the next step. As I said, that when I was explaining that there are two types of wealth: human wealth and radiant wealth. Human wealth is the wealth which we understand by wealth, and radiant wealth comes in the form of knowledge about the deeper truths, about the truths that lie hidden within the heart. So he reaches that level of knowledge, which then, the next step after that, is then the realization of the awareness of the essence of everything, which was then the sixth step, which we discussed, which I had explained that the examples, if you remember, by such as when we have understood a lump of clay, then we have understood everything that is made out of that lump of clay, in that sense. So that is when he then declares that I am the one with the beautiful intellect, with the beautiful insight into the very essence of everything. And then the last one, which we were discussing in our previous class, awareness of his immortality, which we had discussed in great detail in our part of it, because it can be explained in two different ways. The second explanation I'm going to touch upon today, but that explanation, that amṛtokṣitaḥ, this part of the mantra, means that I am immortal and I am imperishable. If we translate it in this way, then in this sense, I had explained it in my previous session. So the point that I was simply trying to make is that there are several Shanti mantras which have this progression. For example, Sahana vavatu sahano bhunaktu sahaviryam karavavahi tejasvina vadhitamastu ma vidvishavahi. When I was explaining that mantra, there too, ma vidvishavahi, may we not hate anyone. That was really a declaration of the very final goal of the whole journey. And somehow what each part of the mantra explains is very progressive in nature. And the same thing also is there. We can look at it, now, next time when we will study the next mantra, Om Purnamadah Purnamidam, the next Shanti mantra. Also, there also, ultimately, in the realization, Purnameva Vashishyati, only the infinite alone remains. So you see that it's leading towards that progressively leading towards a final experience, which is the realization that the infinite alone remains. So this progressive nature, it is the same also in Mandukya Upanishad, in meditating on Om, where first of all one meditates on consciousness in the waking state of consciousness, then consciousness as it experiences the dreaming state of consciousness, then consciousness as it experiences deep sleep, and then consciousness as it is in its essential nature without being influenced by any one of these three states. That is the fourth one. So also in Mandukya Upanishad we find this progressive approach to explain something. So does that...
Well, I have several questions actually.
Yeah.
So I feel like here, this is his declaration.
Yeah, this is his declaration.
Right, yes. And so I feel like what I'm trying to understand is you have then, like Vedanta and yoga have these different kind of progressive frameworks.
Yes.
That sometimes structures a mantra.
Yeah.
And so I feel like then you're taking this progressive framework and then putting it on his declaration.
Yes.
Okay. This is what I was trying to understand.
Yes.
So then the reason why you're doing this is because it's a very kind of common way of structuring the material.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's a very common way of structuring the material. And he has had an experience.
Right.
And what Shankaracharya seems to suggest, that amṛtokṣitaḥ, I will come to this a little bit later if the time permits today, otherwise in the next class, that this last part, amṛtokṣitaḥ, was not even declared by him. It was added later, but he just became completely silent. After having said sumedhaḥ, he became completely silent. And amṛtokṣitaḥ was added by the later author of this, because this is part of an Aranyaka text. So the author of the Aranyaka text has added, the same author who added that this is the declaration of Triśaṅku post-enlightenment. This is obviously, Triśaṅku himself didn't say this. So this was added by another author later. But not only this much, but even amṛtokṣitaḥ, these last two words were added by that author. This is what Shankaracharya believes. And the only possible explanation is that he became completely silent, and the later author simply gave a meaning to his silence in his own word, saying that in his silence, this is what he was experiencing. That I am immortal and imperishable. Or if explained differently, then I'm saturated with the nectar of bliss. The same words can mean two different things. So, but one thing is very clear, that he fell completely silent. You know. So, yeah, so that progressive sort of, yes, that was my way of, and it helps me to understand it better. It helps me to understand how someone like Triśaṅku, it gives a perspective of a journey which must have happened in his life, from being the horrible person that he was, you know, into becoming a seer of the mantras and reaching that complete inner silence through the mantra. Eventually the highest mantra, which is the mantra of silence at the end. So it's a great journey. And after his realization, it seems that he, in a nutshell, because this is an extremely important mantra, it was taught to the students as a mantra that they recited every day. All my 17 years when I was studying or teaching in Kailas Ashram here in Rishikesh, nearly every day except on holidays, but otherwise every single day, all of us, we were reciting it. For all these 17 years, it was part of a... So, it's an important mantra, and it is important to my understanding because it lays out progressively what happened within himself, which led him into complete silence. So, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it sort of, your question sort of made me gaze back onto my own way of presentation and thinking. So it was a very subtle and deep question. So I took time. That's why I took time to answer it. So I had to look at several things, other things also. Okay, so we can come back to the mantra, to the second meaning of this last declaration, amṛtokṣitaḥ. Amrita, it can be amṛtokṣitaḥ, which means I am immortal and imperishable, and it can also be separated as amṛtokṣitaḥ, not akṣitaḥ but ukṣitaḥ. Akṣitaḥ means imperishable, And ukṣitaḥ means saturated, soaked, wetted. So in that sense, then it will be that I am soaked or saturated with nectar, with amrita, with nectar, with the experience of my blissful nature. We often speak in the Upanishads, we often speak of consciousness as having these three, can't even call them its qualities, but that is what it is. Existence, usually when we call it consciousness, it's just one part of it. But it is presence, not even existence, but presence. It is experienced as a presence, and without consciousness, we would never know that something exists or not. It is only after consciousness registers something that we know what is experience. Sometimes mathematically or logically, we understand that something might exist, but then we need experiments. We need experiences to be sure that it really exists. Because when we do experiments, then we experience it. Then consciousness registers it. And then we can say, yes, this exists. Because I can experience it. So, it is that presence, that is how the Upanishads present it, Sat. This famous word, I think, so many of us would have heard it, Satchidananda. Sat, presence, Chit, consciousness. It is not not something of which we become conscious, but it is that which becomes conscious of everything. So, that is the second aspect. And the third one, which the Upanishadic masters, when they speak of it, they call it Sat, presence, Chit, consciousness, and the third one is Ananda. Ananda, translated generally always as bliss or its blissful nature of the self or in all these different ways. But as I have repeatedly pointed out, that Ananda simply means inner prosperity. In an inner state in which nothing is lacking, nothing is required. It is the view of the Vedantic masters is that this is the natural state of our inner being. It is only when it is covered, when we become forgetful of this inner nature, and when it gets covered, that we start to feel that we are lacking something, and thus we need something. We impose the needs of the body or the needs of the mind on the needs or on the witnessing consciousness, which is witnessing these needs. The need arises within the body. The body requires nourishment. The need of hunger. The need arises, which we call hunger. So hunger arises within the body. I, as the witness it, hunger arising. The moment it arises, I impose that on myself and I start saying, I am hungry. Even though I'm witnessing my hunger, hunger is not my very nature. It arises when I've eaten it, it goes away. It's not my essential being. It is something that arises. When it arises, I identify with it, and back identification occurs by saying that I am hungry. I don't say that hunger has risen in me, or, rather I say I am hungry. I completely identify with that. Similarly, when there is less water in the body sends a signal that it requires some water. It manifests itself as thirst. I'm the witness. I'm the one who is witnessing, who is experiencing that thirst arising within the body. I'm a witness, but then I identify with it and I say, I'm thirsty. So in this way, all these different emotions and feelings, they arise, being witnessed by the witness, and the witness in the forgetful nature, that in the forgetful state, that it forgets that I am a mere witness to all these feelings, he, or that essential nature, starts identifying with each one of them, and in that state it forgets that what the masters call the blissful nature, in which nothing is lacking, and then desires to gain, desires to have. We start feeling empty within ourselves, and then we require something to fill that emptiness. And then that blind pursuit unfolds. The further someone goes away from this realization of the masters, that consciousness in itself, which then the next mantra is about, Purna, it is complete, it doesn't lack in anything. So this, and then yes, Trishna, which means desire, thirst, which the Buddha understands as the fundamental cause of all sufferings, which the yogic masters understand the fundamental cause of suffering. They understand it as arising from the forgetfulness of this real nature, which means that if one becomes aware of this real nature, then that desire, which is the cause of all suffering, can be overcome. So the point that when his realization, his last step, that you can call it the last stage, is about this experience in which he feels his existence as being soaked with that bliss, with that inner prosperity, with that state in which he doesn't need anything anymore, in which he doesn't feel that he is lacking anything, but he's just experiencing his completeness. I am complete. This is what the second possible meaning of the word amṛtokṣitaḥ, this word that has been used. And then iti triśaṅkor vedānuvacanam. This is Sage Triśaṅku's Veda which means experience, Triśaṅkor Veda, anu which means afterwards, and vachanam means declaration. Veda, enlightenment, deep insight, understanding, experiential understanding. This is what the word Veda. And that's why when we call this collection of teachings the Vedas, what we simply are trying to say is that it's a collection of the experiences, of the direct insights of the masters through many, many thousands of years, and particularly the most ancient part of the Vedas, they were collected together in their present form. It is believed by most of the historians approximately around 1500 BC. So that is 3,500 years ago. They had already been collected in the present form. So they are a collection of experiences of at least 402 male and female masters, which are referred to as the rishis. Rishi simply means a wise person, or rishikas, as the female mystics, masters were referred to. And it is the collection of their experiences. And hopefully we, as someone walking on this journey of inner experience, can benefit from some of those experiences. And it is for that reason that we study them. So what Shankaracharya here at the end explains here is that not only iti triśaṅkor vedānuvacanam, such was Triśaṅku's declaration after enlightenment. This much obviously was not spoken by Triśaṅku. It was added by the author of the Aranyaka text. What lies before that was the declaration of Triśaṅku. But Shankaracharya goes even a step further. I don't know what is the source of his declaration. It could be that he had access to the original part, because many of the parts of the Vedas are left. So he would have seen the original part and he found amṛtokṣitaḥ not to be there. That's why he inferred that it was added later. What we find there is complete silence after that. After having declared that I have acquired that beautiful intellect, which means that direct insight into the nature of everything, there nothing remains to be said. Complete silence inevitably follows. It is the same like the silence which follows inevitably when, on a verbal level, when one has pronounced ma, because you close your lips. And if you meditate on ma as taught in the Upanishads, silence on an inner level, internal level, because there are two levels of silence. Verbal silence, but the mind is still chattering. So we are not chattering externally, but the chattering still continues. But then meditating on that M, the third letter, that inner silence also follows. And it is that inner silence which is considered the real message of the Upanishads, the real goal of the pronunciation of Om. It's not the letter in itself, but it is the silence which follows. And that's why what I've seen, not with us, but I've seen with many other groups, that, I always give the silence a little bit of time. And other people are so restless that before when I pronounce, somebody is very happy. Somebody is very happy. Sadly, they are polluting the environment in their happiness. That is sad. It's very nice that they are happy, but it is sad that they are polluting the environment with that happiness. So, yes, when I pronounce this Om 3 times in the beginning, I always give silence. At least as much time as we have given to the pronunciation, because that is the most, it's not the pronunciation of Om, but it is the silence which follows is the most important thing, not the pronunciation of Om. That is just as a preparation to prepare us for that silence, so that we can hear the silence which is nothing for us, but with understanding it becomes everything for us. So can we hear, to learn to hear that silence, that is where Om helps us. But some people are so restless that when I want to give space, 1 or 2 or 3 people in the group, they always start saying Om before I do this, and then everybody else starts. And I'm like in silence, and everybody has started pronouncing Om, because they are so much focused on the Om and don't realize the importance of the silence which follows after that. I understand the problem. The problem is there. To appreciate the silence, to understand its significance, its importance, how it is more important than every single word, that requires deep understanding, deep insight, meditation, a meditative tendency. Till that doesn't come, all we have are words. because they give us those small little windows into the nature of reality, through which we can peep. It doesn't open up the nature of reality. That's what silence does. But it at least gives us some windows. That's all. And that's all which we can understand as long as we can't start understanding silence. Also earlier I pointed out that the ideal master in the Vedantic tradition, Dakshinamurti, who is actually worshipped in temples, but most of the times in South Indian temples one finds statues of Dakshinamurti. Up in the ashram we have now installed a temple of Sage Dakshinamurti, and he's an embodiment of the master. And it is interesting that all the deities in India, they always face the east, the direction of the sunrise. Wherever you will see. Okay, this is not... because this Sage Patanjali statue was not completely prana pratishtha. It's not... It didn't undergo the ceremonies in which the prana is established. It is just there to bless us. Because if we would do that, then we would have to do all the rituals every day. So we don't have that. But other temples, such as those down there, or bigger temples, there for many days you perform the rituals where you make the statue alive, you establish prana in it, and all those statues have to face the east. You will see that in all the temples, all the statues, they always face the east. But he faces the direction of death, which is the south. Dakshinamurti, that's why it's called also Dakshinamurti, one of the reasons, because there are many explanations, but I'm just saying one thing. So, and when in prayers to him, there is this beautiful mantra, Chitram Vadatarur Mule, something strange is happening under the banyan tree. Vriddha Shishya, the students are young. The students are old, but the teacher is young. Gurustu Maunam Vyakyanam. Whatever teaching he imparts are all in complete silence. And Shishyas, and the doubts of the students are completely removed. So the ideal teacher of Vedanta does not impart his teaching through words, but through the silence which follows the words. Words are only seen as preparations to be able to appreciate the silence, which inevitably, because one cannot keep on speaking, even the best, how do you call them, chatterboxes? Fall silent after a while, when they are tired and fully exhausted. Silence is inevitable. The Upanishadic masters, whether they say that this is that essential nature from when our speech tries to describe it, it comes back without thoroughly describing it. It cannot describe it thoroughly because this nature is infinite and speech is finite. How can something that is finite, and this applies also to the mind, even mental comprehension, how to grasp the infinite through that which is finite. One has to give up and say this is not possible. And this is the moment when we become completely humble. And that is why the Vedantic masters would say, and in one of the Upanishads the masters says actually that someone who has acquired this type of scholarship, he never speaks above anybody. This is an expression in Sanskrit which means that he doesn't speak ill of everybody. He doesn't downgrade. Like scholars usually, always great scholars, they, because they are the great scholars, who are you? You don't know anything. That type of tendency. But someone who has realized that speech and the mind, they are finite, and what we are trying to describe and comprehend through our mind is infinite, a moment of tremendous humbleness comes. when they declare that the infinite cannot be understood through tools which are finite in nature. And that is when he says that Anyadeva tadveditat, it is different from everything that can be known, and it is also different from that which is unknown. And all such declarations come. But that humbleness that one cannot know it, that humbleness that which Socrates had, which the Vedantic masters, when the Vedantic masters say that it is easy to find scholars of texts, it is easy to find people who can tell us the future, it is easy to find people who can tell us what is right and what is wrong. It is even easy to find people who can say that I have understood Brahman, the teaching of the Vedas. I am a great scholar of the Vedas, but it is very rare to find someone who knows their ignorance. Swadhyana jnano virala. It is extremely rare to find someone who understands the limitation of one's capacity to understand the infinite. And it is in that moment that a person becomes completely humble and gives up this ego pride of knowledge, pride of scholarly knowledge. And for the Upanishadic masters, giving up of this ego is very important. As long as that ego is there, the Upanishadic masters see it as long as that pride is there, the pride of knowing something is there. For them, that is a sign of ignorance. So, it is in this silence, which was then later on to clarify his silence, amṛtokṣitaḥ, this word was added, as well as iti triśaṅkor vedānuvacanam. This one was also added. There is another interesting observation, which is culturally interesting. I don't know it would be interesting for you, but because we have these discussions around castes, and around these things, whether they are firmly grounded in the society or are they progressive in nature. But here, one observation by one of the very ancient commentators is very beautiful, that he points out that originally, yes, Triśaṅku was the son of a king, and that's why he belonged to the warrior class. He was a kshatriya, aristocratic class, the class of the rulers. He was a prince. But then he raised himself above into the class of the scholars, into the class of the wise men, into the class of the Brahmanas. Brahmanas, the ones who know Brahman, ones who know the Vedic teachings, and the ones who know the essential truth of this world. So he's one of those examples where you can see within the life itself. The Sanskrit word for us is varna, which means description. The word caste in English has come from Portuguese, which has this sense of purity in it, chastity. But the Sanskrit word for that is varna, which means description. So his description was that he was a kshatriya, he was a ruler, but with this realization, his description changed. So there was, in fact, in ancient times, this possibility to change one's descriptions. And it is interesting because in his case, we find it, and in the case of his master, teacher, Vishwamitra, we find the same thing, who was first of all born into a different description, and then later on, as the seer of the Gayatri Mantra, he takes a different description. So today, many hardliners usually very much insist against this. And they say that the hardliners, that a description is by birth. If you are born into a particular description, then it cannot be changed. But here are very clear examples that depending on the lifestyle a person takes, also the description changes. So that is interesting. And now, yes, one last thing that I want to say about Triśaṅku is that Triśaṅku is not only a person somewhere far back in the past, but we have to find Triśaṅku within ourselves. That is when Triśaṅku becomes meaningful. Because otherwise, if he's just a historical personality, someone who committed 3 atrocities in his life, and that's why, though he had a beautiful name, as I told you earlier, Satyavrata, the one who has taken the vow of only speaking the truth. He had a beautiful name given by his parents, but then came to be known as Triśaṅku after he had committed these 3 atrocities in his life. A very notorious name, Triśaṅku, the one with the 3 nails, the one with the 3 spikes, the one with the 3 stings of sorrow and pain or guilt, because he had committed these 3 atrocities. What one of the commentators of the 11th century, who is my favorite commentator also on the Upanishads, also on the Gita, because he always explains such seemingly historical events from an inner perspective. He always delves within himself and tries to find the historical personality within himself. So he says that this individual being which is suffering the 3 spikes of suffering, three spikes of the 3 forms of suffering. Suffering, see, we always speak of, even in the context of in the context of yoga, or why do we say Śāntiḥ, Śāntiḥ, Śāntiḥ 3 times? Because suffering in this world is always divided into 3 types of suffering. Internal sufferings, which mean sufferings which come up in the form of diseases, physical diseases as well as mental diseases. They are called internal suffering. And then external sufferings are again divided into 2 forms. One group of suffering is caused by conscious beings, such as by another human being, by an army, or by any other living being, such as if somebody is attacked by an elephant or by a bull or by a tiger or whatever. Suffering caused by other living beings. Suffering caused from within first, suffering caused by other beings, that is the second group of suffering, and the third group is suffering caused by occurrences which are beyond our reach, such as suffering caused by floods, suffering caused by tsunami, earthquake, all these type of sufferings. So adhyatmika, inner suffering, adhibhautika, suffering caused by beings, and adhidaivika, suffering caused by universal powers such as the Mother Earth or water element or cyclones, wind element, or these external elements. These 3 types of suffering. And the individual which is spiked, nailed, is experiencing sorrow as a result of these 3 types of suffering. That suffering human being, a suffering human being, which is suffering, who is suffering these 3 types of suffering, he is Triśaṅku. Triśaṅku, therefore, in other words, even whether it's not important whether he was a historical personality or not, because in the context of the Vedas, the masters always say that if we find stories, it's not important whether it describes a historical event or not. It is a message, and it teaches something about the deeper truths, about the truths that are found within ourselves. So, Triśaṅku therefore symbolizes every suffering being, is ultimately a Triśaṅku. And therefore, by looking at the journey of Triśaṅku, we have hope that we can also follow the same journey and acquire the same goal that Triśaṅku has acquired. So Triśaṅku symbolizes a suffering human being, a human being who suffers. That is the most important thing about Triśaṅku. His historical nature is not at all important. The masters also say that when a person, because the context of this, where this mantra actually occurs, the previous mantras are about selfless service. Karma yoga, they are about selfless service. And so the context suggests that when a person performs karma yoga, which means acts of selfless service, what results is this type of realization as a result of performing acts of selfless service. So the context suggests that karma yoga, one of the three yogas, karma yoga, which is considered the most important of all the three yogas because it is the very foundation, it is the very ground, it is the most important one for inner purification, after which bhakti yoga, which means love, and jnana yoga, which means deep insight, follows naturally. What is important is karma yoga. So the context suggests this, and yes, the masters say that this is a type of darshana. And darshana is also the word for philosophy in Sanskrit language. But yet it is not the same, not exactly the same as philosophy. Because we use, for example, the word yoga darshana, the darshana of yoga as experienced by Patanjali. So Patanjali yoga darshana. But what does that darshana mean? We just easily translate it as philosophy. I think the major difference between philosophy and, because philosophy is that love for knowledge, and it is a very logical pursuit. Here, a logical pursuit has a secondary stage. What is most important is experience, direct experience. And a logical pursuit is only secondary to that, as something that is required and beneficial to lead towards the experience. So that is slightly different when we translate darshana as philosophy, the philosophy of yoga. That is how we translate yoga darshana. Darshana is more an insight. And this precisely, for example, this mantra. Now there is, it's not illogical, but still it is an experience. And this is one of the oldest and most ancient examples of darshana. When we use the word darshana, this is a darshana. What has been described as vedānuvacanam, declaration after experience. Several other masters have described this as the darshana of Triśaṅku, as the experience of Triśaṅku. And with this, see, an experience has never ever to be the same. And it should not be. Every individual human being, when they will experience something, even when we experience the same thing, we experience it slightly differently. We express it in different words because we come to it with different thoughts, with different ideas. So darshana has that scope of diversity in expressions, sometimes even opposite expressions. And that's why the Upanishads, sometimes somebody's experience is like this and somebody's experience is like this. Completely opposite. Somebody's experience is existence, sat, everything arises from existence. Somebody's experience is everything comes out of non-existence. In the same way like the Buddhist masters, we also find it in the Upanishads. Like for the Buddhist masters, that non-existence, shunya, is the most important thing. And here in the Upanishad, for most of the masters, existence is the most important thing. Yet some masters also speak the negative language. They speak the language of non-existence. And other masters say, how is this possible? And yet it is their experience. We have collected, the masters have collected all these experiences. Now the question is, what is our experience? This is their experience, this is their experience. What is our experience? So Darshana, depending on the angle, depending on the approach which we have, depending on the inclinations, depending on the time and space in which a person lives, what message he or she wants to give to the society through that experience, everything that gives cultural diversity in the teachings of the mystic masters. And that's why this is an approach in which we appreciate diversity. We don't try to impose uniformity, that every experience should be completely the same. Like this only, and only when it is like this it is correct, otherwise it is wrong. This approach does not exist. I see it as a beautiful approach because it goes back to that fundamental nature of the Vedic teachings that yes, the truth is one, but ekam sat, the truth is one, but the wise express it in numerous ways. It can be expressed in numerous ways, which I think is one of the most powerful messages that the Vedas can give. That's when we can appreciate any beautiful teaching that tells us, that gives us an insight into ourselves, whether it is the beautiful teachings of the Sufi masters, whether it is the beautiful teachings of the Buddhist masters, whether it is the why should the truth be conditioned by any culture, by any language, by any nationality, by any ethnicity, by any limitation? Why? Why should it be conditioned? So, Darshana is that. Darshana is not about telling others how mistaken they were, but Darshana is about appreciating diversity by respecting their experience as genuine as well. That is the difference between Darshana and, I think, a rather philosophical approach, which is also there in India also. Several later philosophers, particularly in the medieval times, they had a very such approach, telling others what is wrong and having debates and all these things. But the Upanishadic masters don't have that. They are all embracing, all encompassing, which is what makes them very beautiful. So with this, we have completed this mantra. It took a little bit more time. Om Śāntiḥ, Śāntiḥ, Śāntiḥ. Next time.
No, I liked it. It was very good.
It was a beautiful mantra.
I like this. This is my favorite so far.
Beautiful till now. Yes. I think it most likely it will remain the most beautiful one because let's see what is in store. But it is certainly, it was very beautiful, because it is.
I was just like Triśaṅkor was a bad person.
Yeah. I forgot to tell Mataji that he was born as a king.
Yeah.
Then he was declared to be a Chandala, which is an outcast by the society. Lower than the Shudras, the fourth caste, lower than that, socially declared by everybody as a Chandala. That, and then again in the end, he becomes a Brahmana. So he makes a complete circle. He has gone through all the stages in his life.
That's why this, when I used to go to the jail to see the small children, so then one day they had, somebody came, he was also I think almost 20 years he was in jail because he was a murderer.
He was a murderer.
And he was from Bihar. And so then after 20 years he was released. And he went back to his village. I met him, I talked to him, that was very beautiful. And then when he came back to the village, everybody said he's a kuni. How you say
Kuni?
Still after 20 years he was considered as a
Somebody
murderer.
who has blood on his hands. Kuni.
Someone who has blood on his hands. And but he stayed there, and somehow he had that inner power to say, look, I have been now 20 years in jail, and I have, how you say,
Transformed
myself.
Yeah.
So now I feel, you know, he was really helping himself.
Yeah.
And then he started, thought, okay, I will do a good work. And so he wanted to teach children. But nobody allowed his children to go to him to learn. You know, because everybody was worried. But then he really made such efforts, and he proved himself that slowly, more and more children, they came to him and they started, he was teaching them. And now it's in Bihar, somewhere in a village. He's having quite a nice school with many children, and it was even in this India Today it came. And really how he came up, you know. So, and of course they called him also to come there to talk to all the prisoners, you know, those who are
to inspire them,
which are released. So to inspire them,
to make a new start.
Whatever they have done, somehow everybody has a chance to come up again. You know, it was a very beautiful meeting.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking.
Exactly the same thing. Exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing. Yeah. How he came up, made a new start, and
A new start.
evolved, developed himself into again being a good person. Yeah. Yeah. That is what Triśaṅku. Everybody has a chance. Everybody has a chance. If we are just ready to make an effort. Yes. Yes.
So this addition of someone later, this happens frequently.
Yeah.
Because I remember, I don't know if this is analogous, but I remember with Upanishad, like how the last mantra is just completely changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I just wonder why this kind of happens. You know,
Yeah,
like why don't you just
in the case of the Ishavasya Upanishad, the reason is different. In the case here, it is different. Here, this is an Aranyaka text. And Aranyaka texts, because they are.
But why just not let him be silent? You know, I mean, why then add this like?
Yeah. This is also iti triśaṅkor vedānuvacanam is added by the author of the Aranyaka, and because the Aranyaka, you have first the most ancient part, Samhita, then you have the Brahmana, then you have Aranyaka, and these Aranyaka texts, they quote ancient sayings and then add some information about that saying. So this is what has been done here by the author of the Aranyaka. He quoted an ancient master.
But why do they do that?
Because they quote. Why do we quote? Why do we quote the teachings of ancient masters? The Upanishads are the last part. In the Upanishads we find so many ancient mantras being quoted. So they are quoting it. And that's the only reason that they are quoting. And thankfully he did.
He makes it his own though, because he adds.
He adds, yes, that much is his own, yes. Yes, but thankfully he quoted, but otherwise this beautiful mantra would not have survived.
But how would we even know then if this added part, because we don't know whether this part was added or not?
That is Shankaracharya.
Not the declaration part. But
Shankaracharya makes it clear in his commentary. And Shankaracharya, I suppose, back then 1200 years ago, would have had access to the original part from which it was taken. And that's why he would know that it was not there in the original. No, it is here, so therefore it is added by the Arabic text. That's why he says this. Otherwise, how would he say it? That's what I believe.
Yoga Sutras also some have less sutras.
Yeah, there are different recensions. In the case of Ishavasya Upanishad, it's two streams of schools who have preserved two different versions.
Okay.
Because it was preserved in memory so slowly. No. Okay. It's just that the version is a little bit different. Slightly different.
But I mean, then wouldn't this then in some ways be two different versions? I mean, one's just a version in the Rig Veda and one's a version of this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The way he preserves it. That's his version. Now we don't have access to the original anymore because in the original this part is nowhere. I tried to search it everywhere.
So
I could not find
it.
it.
In the Rig Veda.
No, nowhere.
Okay.
Nowhere. In nowhere else it is found.
I see. So then there's material that originally was perhaps in the Rig Veda and then dropped, but then it's preserved later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
I see.
Yeah, because several of the recensions got lost. Yeah, they got lost. Either because there was no one to memorize them, or if they were written down, then by the time of the 12th century, when the Vijayanagara Empire was established, in fact it was Sayana, the great prime minister of the first prime minister of the Vijayanagara Empire, who sent scholars all over India and collected all these recensions and then wrote a commentary on them. So even by the time, he was fearing that they will get lost. And a lot must have been lost. And today, from some sentences of Sage Patanjali in his commentary, where he lists all the different recensions, he says Rig Veda had 21 and Samaveda had 1,000.
Oh my gosh.
And today, just out of 21 from the Rig Veda, only 2 are available. Okay. Out of 1,000, only 4 are available.
Okay.
So
this makes a lot of sense because, you know, in the West we speak a lot about like authorial intent, and you don't necessarily go around changing things in this way, and I think it's just because things were written down.
Yeah.
For, you know, and we just don't kind of have all of these different recensions and variations.
Yeah.
So then I think with these variations, then people can a little bit add more, or, you know, take away, and it's not so important.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's how. That was the only. I mean, if you think how they preserved when there was nothing to write down, just on memory, these things were bound to happen, and yet they had complex systems so that interpolation cannot occur. So that's beautiful. Yeah. Any? Yes, please. Please.
I'm new student, so I have lots of questions, but I don't think to be fair to approach them because I really have different people. So
I can spend a few moments after the class with you, no problem. I'd love to listen to your questions.
Is there a Sanskrit which helps to new students to identify in which stage they are reaching if the individual feels that it's on the right path, because all evidence and assess are projecting that this is the way forward, or the feedbacks are coming through as right. Is there some self-identification way how individual is able to observe which stage is reaching, or where I am on my path? That's my question.
I think that is where meditation and self-analysis becomes the most important thing, because in the same way, we cannot ask anybody, what is the opposite of hungry? Full, yes. We cannot ask somebody else and ask him, am I full now? After I've had my lunch, I cannot go around and ask, do you think am I full? I myself will know it when I'm full. And that's why the masters give, these definitions of what is dharma, what is correct, what is right, and what is wrong, and all these complex definitions. But at the end, always, hridayena abhyanujjata, and that which is permitted by your heart. So ultimately, that is what matters. That it should feel correct. It should feel proper. It should feel good. We have to learn to trust our feelings. We have to learn to trust how we feel about it, how our heart feels about it. I think it's the same with yoga asanas also. In certain postures, when we do something wrong, yes, initially teachers help us in identifying what is right and what is wrong. But the more we learn how to observe, the light of yoga in ourselves tells us that what is right and what is wrong. That is what the yogic masters would call the inner master. To get in touch with the inner master. When the inner master itself tells us that, yes, this is the correct thing, and this is the wrong thing. So I think that is only the ultimate answer to that. Beyond that, of course, yes, we can do a lot of questioning. We can make the life of our teachers miserable, and we should do that. We should really do that. If somebody is teaching something, then let us ask as many questions as we can and criticize and say that if you have said this, how is this possible? We should never accept anything simply because, never accept something because Patanjali has said it. Yes, certain things we cannot know now. So we have to accept it, that they have said it, it must be true, but only for a while. Ultimately, our own experience has to be the judge and tell us whether it is right and wrong. So I think we can conclude. सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत् ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः विश्वशान्तिः. Thank you very much.